Always give people a few minutes to join. But this one was a lot. Wait a second. How's everyone doing? Anything exciting?
Every day on the DGQC is an exciting one, Russ.
Yeah, it's been a long few days. Yesterday, I only got to like do the reading on my own. I did a bunch of stuff for Father's Day, which I usually don't take time off for a lot of stuff, but we had a good time. Played some board games. Nice. But because of that, I'm a little behind on this one, so it's going to be a fun reading. Because I realized, holy shit, of all the ones, like, I could have skipped so many other ones and just been probably fine. But this one is like, oh great, cool. I have no idea about half of this shit, and it's so dense. This one is so fucking dense. So dense.
Like diamonds in the sky.
Not sure that's where I'd put it, but sure, we'll go with that. Well, this may be the group we have today, which is fine because it's going to be more of a roundtable, I think, than a few of our other discussions. So I'll kick it off and we'll do a little bit of announcements and then we'll dive into the 16th series of the Static Ontological Genesis. But first, I have to begin with, as always, thank all of you for coming and joining us on this lovely Monday for our ongoing reading with the DGQC reading of Logic of Sense. You can find us on Twitter, DNGQC. If you like what we're doing on Patreon, every dollar helps. We're slowly going to be putting that towards, it looks like, trying to put together a mini online conference for some of the stuff we're doing, and that's on Patreon, DGQC. Any major announcements, things to bring up, anything to talk through as we move into this reading? Jack, Ken, Circle, anyone? Ben? Oh, excellent. Yes, you did lose me. I had I fucked up on the audio. I've been talking for 3 minutes. That's good. Did I miss anything?
No, you did not.
Okay, good. All right, I'll take that. Sorry about that, Ben. Are we good with announcements though?
Yeah, I think so.
All right, that works for me. So I mean, I just spent the last 3 minutes rambling about how I think we should start this off, but I'll put this out. Where does anyone here, where do we want to start this discussion? Because the entirety of the 16th series, the surface topology, impersonal and pre-individual nomadic singularities that constitute the real transcendental field, the genesis of things, of what things are. Where do we want to begin this discussion? Because we don't have 6 hours, and I actually don't have an answer for that.
I think what we need to do is just recall series 15, which kind of leads into this. So in series 15, Deleuze discovers that what he calls the transcendental field as a, quote, world teeming with anonymous and nomadic, impersonal and pre-individual singularities as a condition of the true genesis. And I think it's from that point which he repeats in the first, he repeats that in the first sentence. So what he's going to do in series 16, he's going to begin to detail a way in which the neutrality and productivity of sense in relation to propositions and state of affairs can be reconciled. I think this is his, so I think he's developing out of that notion of the transcendental field that was kind of discovered. So he went down, you could think of the transcendental field as a foundation, the basic level. And what he's going to do is going to kind of come out of that in the other direction in a way. And I think that first sentence is quite important because he talks about, so the surface topology, so it's the field, this transcendental field. And he talks about the impersonal and pre-individual. And what he's going to do is going to set out he's going to go away from the impersonal and the pre-individual towards the individual and the personal. And in relation, so the first is in relation to the world. And the other thing, the structure is in 2 parts. In this series, it's a 2-part structure. And the first part of the structure is to do with the individual and the world. And then the second part of the structure is to do with the personal.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair point and very fair.
So he says the second sentence. So he immediately starts to talk about the individual, and I think it might be useful to think what does he mean by individual. So he says the way in which the individual is derived out of this field represents the first stage of the genesis. So it's in stages. The genesis, the production is in stages, and the first stage is the way in which the individual is derived out of this field, the transcendental field of pre-individual nomadic singularities.
Yeah, the individual, it's worth going over what he means here by individual, because he opens up the first 2 or 3 paragraphs talking through that pretty heavily.
So I think we have to remind ourselves what the transcendental field is. So this kind of begins with Husserl in Cartesian Meditations, where he uses the terminology of Leibniz to talk about monads, but by that he means these anonymous pre-personal ego, which is the subject of passive synthesis. And so, that's kind of the beginning place. But what's in the background is genetic phenomenology, where where Husserl tries to explain how these monads come into existence as the basis of subjectivity. And then this gets picked up by Fink, who talks about the third ego. So there's the mundane ego of Descartes, the cogito, and then there's the transcendental ego of Kant, and then there's this pre-personal ego that that Fink calls the third ego. And then this kind of more or less becomes Dasein in Heidegger. It becomes the tacit ego in Merleau-Ponty. And so eventually Merleau-Ponty and Sartre kind of settle on this terminology of the transcendental field to talk about this field of perception where there's visibilities and invisibilities mixed together. And so that's where the transcendental field is. And then the whole question is here, how does the individual arise out of the pre-personal? And he's saying these singularities are the pre-personal and they're the monads. So I think that's kind of an interesting extension of this set of ideas.
I was kind of curious to the use of individual because coming off the heels of Sartre, right, we're moving away from right two positionals of consciousness and the relationship of an ego as an object in the world at the horizon of the world, right? So Deleuze is taking that even further to get out of the centrality of consciousness. And so it's interesting here as we think about the individual and, like you're saying, the pre-personal, because it looks like where Deleuze is taking us not only into the monad, but it looks like he's going to expand this into bodies, particularly. And I thought this was interesting to go back to this application from the Stoic. Even color here is going to function as bodily, right?
So there's a really good book called The Heretic and the Courtier that explains the meeting between Leibniz and Spinoza. and so that you can see that Leibniz's philosophy is just a reaction to Spinoza. And basically what Leibniz wants to do is he wants to save miracles. And so he tries to come up with a philosophy in which you can imagine miracles occurring, which is kind of hard to imagine with Spinoza's idea that God is nature. And so it's really behind the scenes of this chapter this series is this relationship between Leibniz and Spinoza. And of course, Deleuze has written books on Spinoza, 2 books on Spinoza and 1 on Leibniz. The Leibniz book is much later. But the interesting thing he does in the Leibniz book is contrast monads to Dasein. And he kind of shows this duality between monads and Dasein. So I think that's the most interesting thing in the Leibniz book that's relevant here.
Well, so with that,
the Monadology by Leibniz is not a very long book, so it's worth reading the Monadology if you haven't managed to read it yet.
So with that, and thank you for all that background, because there's so much to this that, I mean, there's just a great deal to this one. So thank you. The opening here to me, as we're talking through this, is about talking through the transcendental field, as you brought up and as you discussed, but talking about sort of the process with which it creates that maybe, I don't know how to put it. I think actually maybe he puts it better than I can, where it's essentially playing through this idea that this one sucks. The first setup of actualization, because as Derek was talking about, there's kind of 2 parts to this, and there's the first level of actualization, which is the as he terms it, individual world interindividuality. This actualization at this first level of the field, the field itself, is always individual and collective, because being actualized belongs to individuals in the world. There's a setup here. The way he pushes through it, as I'm sort of understanding, is he's, and again, I read this in a very processual nature. It's about talking through literally the steps that these things have in order to be created, and that they are effectively byproducts of this overall process of becoming that happens. It starts with singular points that the singularities get extended over ordinary points. And this happens all the way up to another singularity, the turning points as he calls them. These ultimately, these singular points that extend over ordinary points become part of a singularity, the event. And this becomes part of that sort of larger continuum of singularities that make up sort of the base layer for the empirical world. And that's kind of the first couple paragraphs here, as I have it understood. And Circle is referring to this wonderful set of notes. I'm going to do a copy and paste into the chat so you can see it. But no? Because that's, I want to spend some time going through literally the order of this, because it opens up where he's talking about the world that envelops an infinite system of singularities selected through convergence. How does this come to be? From the point of view of static genesis, the structural individual world individuality is the first level. At this first level, singularities are actualized both in the world and in the individuals that are parts of it. To be actualized or to actualize oneself means to extend over a series of ordinary points, to be selected according to a rule of convergence, to be incarnated in a body, to become the state of the body, to be renewed locally for the sake of a limited new actualizations and extensions. Not one of these characteristics belongs to singularities as such. They rather belong to the individuated world and to the worldly individuals which envelop them. This is why actualization is always both collective and individual, internal and external, etc. It's this idea that it's not the expression, it's the act of being expressed that is the thing he's talking about. It's the act of it rather than the thing.
I think this first part is quite complex, but I think in one way it's kind of useful to think in terms of propositions, because he uses two terms to distinguish between the individual and the personal. And the terms are the analytic and then the synthetic. And if you're familiar with Kant, you'll know the analytic, in terms of analytic judgment, means the what's being said is contained within the thing itself, whereas the synthetic brings things from outside. So the analytic is kind of its meaning is intrinsic, whereas the synthetic will bring things together. And I think the individual, which is being talked about in the first part, is essentially analytic. And what he says later, he says that it's descriptive. So it describes the conditions, shall we say? Although that's probably not the right word.
No, I think that's an okay word for it. It's him saying, it's not that any longer that a frog greens or a tree greens, but that a tree is green. I think it's a fair way to put it. Unless I misunderstood you.
No. I'm just trying to, as you. I think you're right, Brooks. I think we need to go through this I'd try to go through it in a sequentially, I would say, really, to try and get our heads around it, because for me there's kind of chunks of it which I find difficult to understand, but then I think as it goes on it seems to become clearer. That's why I've read this, and I think it's to do with the relationship to Leibniz, which is not clear, because I think I suspect one, although I think the way I read it was that this notion of the individual is pre-personal, so it's not to do with the subject, So going back to transcendental, it's kind of within Kant that has a notion that has relation to the subject, whereas the individual, the way I read it was that it's something that doesn't have the kind of notion of consciousness attached to it at that point. That's kind of related to the subject. And I would say it seems what Deleuze seemed to be saying was that the individual and the monad have a kind of relationship in the way in which, and the relationship is to the world, because as he says at the beginning of this series, he says that the world and the individual kind of go together. So there is a way in which the individual and the world are constructed in their interrelationship. And I think one way that relationship is expressed within propositional. So the propositions that express the individual are analytic. So it is perhaps one way to think about it. It might be that it's a single world that's being created, whereas the subject later on, there's a number of worlds attached to that one subject.
Yeah, the use of individual or subject here is going to get super wonky, because I'm with you. I mean, it's definitely pre-personal. We're not talking about the subject, I think, at any point of this, but the use of individual throughout it and talking about things that are clearly subjects is where my brain started to try to have difficulty, because again, and we're gonna have to get into it at some point. The use later on in this series of ego and personhood and these other things that he's absolutely discussing, it starts to lose me. I'd had the same experience you did, which is, wait, no, and then slowly making more sense. Towards the end, it started to fall apart again. Because the use of the word individual here is just really, in my brain, breaking a few things. Unless is it that he's referring, because again, this is the DNR era of Deleuze. Is he referring essentially to kind of this, the singularities, or the little bits of things, that is that transcendental field, and this is the first element that sort of is emergent of that it's formed by it, and we're not quite at the point of subjectivity, which there's a lot more coming in the next few series of how he believes this gets generated, or how sense is utilized by it and creates it. But is this like the first thing that's generated is the parts of Brooks that are Brooks-ish or Brooksing, I guess?
I think again, just thinking about the overall series, I think this first, like I said, it's in two parts. So the first stage, there's two stages of genesis within this series. The first stage is the individual, and the individual is in relation to the world, and how that world is constructed, perhaps, in terms of singularities and a kind of the stretching of the singularity over the line, and the ordinary lines. But what he does say towards the end of this series, he says that this constitutes sense. So the individual and the world is sense, whereas the subject, which is the next stage, is nonsense. So here we have, I think what we have here is a kind of series which are kind of, how should I say, and perhaps not activated as, or have a relationship, but the actual more, the kind of creative activation it perhaps comes along in the second stage, because there you have the kind of nonsense kind of circulating between the series. That's what I think might be happening.
I think this diagram you posted, Brooks, is pretty good.
Yeah, it's a random PDF I grabbed off Academia, and it's phenomenal. To me, it helps me understand, because I think a lot of what Derek is saying is pretty spot on. It's the difficulty here is we're talking about kind of two parts, because this static ontological genesis The creation of the person and the individual happens in two stages. The first level is that of the individual, which, as Derek said, is the work of sense. And it happens through these singular points extending over ordinary points, which resonate inside of singularities, which extend into this larger continuum of singularities. And at some point, nonsense comes in, the aleatory point with the ambiguous sign, the vague elements, these things, the works of nonsense start playing with singularities, and a problematic as event as singular points generates different other secondary sort of components of this. And it's these two levels of thinking through the idea of the individual or the persons. We're not quite at subject yet, but it's a really interesting sort of way to think through those bits. And it feels like this is what Deleuze is really trying to get at here. It's tough. Let's talk through the first one, because let's talk through the way sense generates individuals. Because I mentioned it and Derek got into it a little bit. I want to just read a quick passage here. It's from 112 on my reading. The page starts with "does not exist." Just a few sentences in there. To green indicates a singularity event in the vicinity of which the tree is constituted. To sin indicates a singularity event in the vicinity of which atom is constituted. But to be green or to be a sinner are now the analytic predicates of constituted subjects, namely the tree and atom. Since all individual monads express the totality of their world, although they express clearly only a select part, their bodies form mixtures and aggregates, variable associations with zones of clarity and obscurity. This is why even here relations are analytic predicates of mixtures. Adam ate of the fruit of the tree. Moreover, contrary to certain aspects of Leibnizian theory, which is a great word to say, it is necessary to assert that the analytic order of predicates is an order of coexistence or succession, with neither logical hierarchy nor the character of generality. This is the generation of the individual as he's talking through it. To have a color is no more general than to be green, since it is only this color that is green, and this green that has this shade, that are related to the individual subject. This rose is not red without having the color of this rose. Here, subject, I have a feeling, is not the capital S subject, but instead like the grammar subject, like the subject of the sentence or the proposition, I think is what we're talking about here.
Yeah, I think in this section, this is a good section to kind of look at to try and understand this, because I think he's talking here. So if we go back to those two propositions earlier, where he said Adam the sinner, Adam non-sinner, and they kind of, I think they relate to that kind of Stoic idea. When you place two propositions next to each other, they're not, one is not commenting on the other. He's saying that they have this. He said that they have. Where is it? They is an order. It says it's an order. So not proposition, predicate. Sorry. Oh, sorry. Yeah. No. The analytical order predicate is an order of coexistence or succession, with neither logical hierarchy nor the character of generality. So then he goes on to say, when a predicate is attributed to an individual subject, it does not enjoy any degree of generality. Having a colour is no more general than being green. So being an animal is no more general than being reasonable. So that animal and reasonable is the definition of man, the kind of classic definition of an animal with reason, with sense. And it's like in that order, the animal and reasonableness are kind of equal. They're not, one is not over the other. So no, I think this is a good section to kind of try and understand.
Yeah, I mean, when we talk about the color, for example, we're going back to this sort of how to put it, that denotation, as an example, is just a true or false thing. It is it red or not? It's not making a judgment or prefacing or privileging one element over another. It's very just sort of on-off binary yes, no. Yes, the flower is red. It's not that this flower is only ever red. It's the sentence doesn't have like all of these other bits of baggage that kind of do get attached when we have such a thing. The red is not a color without having the color red. He goes into a larger thing here when he's talking about the sort of general in the setup. Where's the fucking line I really liked? It doesn't matter. I can't find it. But here, ultimately, he's talking about kind of at this base layer, we have, singularities. We have all these, ordinary points and all the stuff of things. And it's just all of these mixtures sort of in and out of each other. And we're grabbing little bits and turning them into propositions or ideas or things that we're discussing. It's this setup, and it's ultimately just a description of the mixture. Is that how he ends that paragraph? That this first layer is ultimately just a description of the mixtures of all these things that are happening here, the aggregates, as it may be. And I really like that idea because it goes back to, again, how all of these points gets organized, how the singularities, the singular points, the ordinary points, all of them are sort of out there as the bodies and events and all these other elements and what it may be, but they're just the mixtures of them. There's not another layer to it, I guess I would say, is how it seems like he's describing to it, that is the base layer. That's the floor, the terrain, I think he goes on to call it.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think you're right. I think what he's saying is that, so in another way, one might think that if you talk in terms of, say, genus, species, class, whatever, the different kind of layers, a different kind of hierarchical relationship between things. One might say that the genus is an animal, and then it's, I don't know, species might be that it's got reason. So man is part of the genus animal, but it's in a species of having reason. Whereas what he's saying here, that's not the case. It's not working that way. It's an order of that the analytical order of predicates is an order of coexistence. So they exist at the same level. There's not one above the other. So he says with neither logical hierarchy nor the character generality. So again, if we looked at the kind of predicate animal, that could be seen as a general kind of thing, in which there's lots of things are inside it. But here, it's an animal with reason.
Yeah, he goes on to say, analytic predicates do not yet imply logical considerations of genus and species or of properties and classes. They imply only the actual physical structure and diversity, which make them possible in the mixture of the body. This is why we identify in the last analysis the domain of institutions as immediate representations, the analytic predicates of existence, and the descriptions of mixtures and aggregates. And he did. In the singularity, he's very clear that that's what the singularities are, is ultimately just, as he says here, the descriptions of mixtures or aggregates.
Yeah, so I think it's useful to try and think then. So that's the end of that first part, the first part of this first stage, I should say, of this actualization. First stage of the Genesis, as he calls it, going back to the beginning. And so there is this notion of the individual and the world, and the individual and the world are kind of expressed within their relationship. And so, and he says now on the trend, the first actually, so on that establishes a terrain or a world, a terrain, let's call it a terrain, as he says. This is the first actualization. Then a second level is established and developed. And this is where that notion of the subject, and this moves from the analytic, in which things that are expressed alongside each other, to a synthetic where things are brought from the outside, really, are brought together. And this is the ego. This is where the kind of idea of the ego kind of develops in this next level, the second level.
As we move from the individual to the person, that's very specific the way he talks about that. Which I think time for us to move forward to. Any thoughts or questions or ideas or anything we've missed up to this point? Because once we move on, I'm not sure we're going to be able to like dive backwards. Like now, chat, questions, anything.
So yeah, I just think I'm just trying to express this first part clearly, but I think the world, the individual has the way I was reading it is that the individual doesn't have this kind of is not this subject. It's not this kind of thinking thing that directs itself towards things. It has this other character, which is and so I'm just reading this again. And then, yeah, so the idea is, and I think the individual is the equivalent to the monad, because in that next paragraph, the question he asks, what is it in the ego that transcends the monad? It's appurtenances and predicates. And this is a kind of classic question of philosophy. You know, how do you kind of transcend? How is this notion of transcendence achieved? And this question is being asked again, I think, again, but this is asked by Husserl. And Deleuze calls it the problem of the fifth Cartesian meditation. What is it in the ego that transcends the monad?
I have a question. Is the second stage of this kind of a development, he is comparing the individual or the person to to Leibniz's monads, because there's a kind of characteristic of incompossibility, of the individual persons with Leibniz's monads.
So as I read it, I would say that the individual, yes, he's being pretty clear that the individual is ultimately kind of, I mean, I'm not super in Leibniz or monads. I have very, very light understanding, but I would say yes, that it's the individuation of this not the person yet, but the individual that's made, or that is monad. That is a monad, effectively.
So that's in the first stage or the second stage?
First stage. First stage is basically monad generation. I know that sounds terrible, but
yeah,
that's how I read it. The way he's talking through the interindividuality, the actualization of the individual, and all of that. To me, I read it as we're talking at this point about effectively all that stuff is monads, and that includes the individual itself. The individual selves which populate these worlds. Individuals are constituted in the vicinity of singularities which they envelop. They express worlds as circles of converging series which depend on these singularities. That's the thesis of the monad, that the individual monad expresses the world. I think is a phrase he even says earlier in this. But to me, right, we are talking ultimately about all of that stuff being monads. It's all monads all the way down, I guess.
Okay. So all the different stages, okay, because it would include this characteristic of incompossibility, which how Leibniz describes the individual person. Right? They have a kind of subjectivity that differentiates them from each other, from other monads.
I'm going to say yes, but I'm going to let someone else answer better.
I think the subject of subjectivity is appropriate to the second one we're looking at now, I would say, because I think this is where the So the question is, so that just looking at the third sentence in that paragraph, what is it that gives the monad the sense bestowal pertaining to transcendency proper? So it's in the second stage that the sense, the transcendental kind of kicks in terms of the bestowal of sense on what is before it. I think that doesn't relate to the individual or to the, or let's call it the monad, but of the previous one. This is a question that this is the problem of Husserl's fifth Cartesian meditation. What is it in the ego that transcends a monad? And what it gives the monad the sense bestowal pertaining to transcendency proper. So previously that we had this analytic kind of relationship to things in the world, which is kind of descriptive. One thing follows another. Not one doesn't have a kind of priority over the other. Whereas here, that's the first stage in which that kind of the terrain, as he calls it, of the first actualization is created. And on that terrain is this second level in which the subject engages in this sense, this notion of sense, get the sense bestowal, this bestowing of sense on things that it encounters. But what, so this is a question that Husserl asks in Fifth Cartesian Meditation. But Deleuze says the solution cannot be phenomenological, since the ego is no less constituted than the individual monad. And he said, but then he goes on, if looking the next sentence, then if you're looking for a kind of a difference between the monad and the ego or the subject, it's kind of contained in the next sentence. So he says this monad is a living individual, was defined within a world as a continuum or circle of convergences. So things are brought together, but the ego is a knowing subject. So that again, so the monad is a living individual, ego is a knowing subject. So that the difference in that way appears when something is identified inside the worlds, which are nevertheless incompossible, and across series, which are nevertheless divergent. So here there is the first one has this notion of convergence, and this one has the second one has the notion of divergence.
JK, do you mean to say that possibility and incompossibility is necessary for constituting individuals?
Yeah, I think that's Leibniz's term for describing the individual person, right? Because they're not they're distinguished from other monads because they are persons, individual persons.
Yeah.
Compossibility would be the first stage, I think, right, where the individuals are indistinguishable from others. But in the second stage, they become more distinguished from others.
What I'm getting out of it is, yeah, I think you're right that there's a synthesis of the world and therefore the individual, because they're sort of reciprocative here through expression, it seems. But at the same time, the point about the incompossibility seems to be looking at, it seems to call into question like the necessary and possible, because we're seeing how, this is 111 in my copy, the contradiction between Adam the sinner and Adam non-sinner results from the incompossibility of worlds in which Adam sins or does not sin. In each world, the individual monads express all the singularities of this world and infinity, as though in a murmur or a swoon, but each monad envelops or expresses, clearly so-called, a certain number of singularities only, that is, those in the vicinity of which it is constituted and which links up with its own body. So what I'm getting out of that is that there's, like you're saying, there's the synthesis of the individual and the world in the compossible. But through the incompossible, we're seeing an extension of that, which is making possible, or rather shows us what has been made possible in that one, there's contingency, right? And two, that just like with Adam and Sinner, right? It's just there's also the differential relationship of Adam and the world that's constituted thereby in this question of whether or not Adam has sinned, right? So you're getting the possibility of different worlds and different individuals with what appears to be the necessity of certain singularities actualized through bodies.
I think one of the main differences between the first level, the individual, and the second level of the subject is this notion of world, what the kind of the world and where it's located, and he says that sorry, I'm just trying to find it now. I've lost it. Right, he says. This is a paragraph beginning now on the terrain of the first actualization. So it's beginning of when he's talking about this, the second level of the actualization. He says that again, I've lost it. Right, yeah. In this case, the subject is vis-a-vis the world in a new sense of the world. So in the first one, the individual, there is the world and the individual go together in a particular way, whereas the subject there's a different understanding of world there. And he goes on to say, whereas the living world was in the world and the world within him or her. So that's the first one. That's the first, the individual and the world. That's the umwelt. Umwelt means, it's usually translated as environment. It kind of means surrounding world. Whereas for the subject, the subject is within the world is within the subject. I think he says somewhere. I've kind of lost that, but I think there is two different understandings of world within play there. And he says. So Deleuze says we cannot follow Husserl when he puts into play the highest synthesis of identification inside a continuum, all the lines which converge or concord. He said this is not the way to transcend the first level, and this is the kind of key of what's trying to happen here, is that the first level of the world, which is of the individual and the world, and the umwelt, in which the world, living individual is in the world and the world is within the individual. This needs to be transcended. One can imagine it's some kind of a continuum. As he says, it's kind of a circular thing. It needs to be transcended. It needs to be got out of. But he says this is not the way to transcend it. Husserl's notion of doing that. And he says only when something identified between divergent series between incompossible worlds, an object equal X appears transcending individuated worlds, and the ego, which thinks it transcends world individuals, giving thereby to the world a new value in view of the new value of the subject which is being established. So here we have the appearance of the object equal X, which has been called things like the paradoxical object previous to this.
So the first step is effectively the individuation things, and as we move through that, and we have these different series, at some point an aleatory point exists within the singularities or within any of this that, as I'm reading this and as I understand it, is essentially the paradoxical element that allows nonsense to be generated, allows nonsense to exist, which allows sense to sort of exist in the first place. But there's this element of nonsense is essentially that incompossibility is where the subject pops into things. It's I'm gonna say, yeah, it feels like the sense that he's been talking about here, the combination of sense and nonsense through, Alice and everything else, has been pushing towards this idea that the subject exists in a way that the sense and nonsense made of the world are ultimately what generate it. And here he very clearly says, the section Derek just read out, only when something is identified between divergent series or between incompossible worlds. That's the aleatory point, paradoxical element, the thing that these are not bodies that go together or make sense, and but still they can be experienced or sensed. And this nonsense that generates this is the ego that gives itself that sort of view askew of the way things are, and suddenly its subject is established inside of that.
Yeah, so he says the ego, which thinks it transcends worldly individuals. So the worldly individuals, it's an interesting phrase, worldly individuals. So the individuals of the world, so they're alongside the world. They're not somehow above it or defining it. They're alongside it. Where the ego, the idea is to transcend that, get out of that. And he says, thereby giving the world a new value in view of the new value of the subject. So the subject is being established in a new way through this process.
Yeah,
and he goes on to say, to understand this, sorry, go on.
No, I was just going to add in, because he uses this really interesting language on that point where he talks about the problem, singular point. It behooves the problem to refer to conditions which constitute superior and positive indetermination. It behooves the event to be subdivided endlessly and also to be reassembled in one and the same. It behooves singular points to be distributed according to mobile and communicating figures, which make it's a really cute version of language that he's using there. It behooves these things to do this. And while Leibniz didn't sort of go far enough with this, I'll let you continue, Doc. I just really liked his phrasing around that, because it's really sort of a cute way to put it.
Yeah, and then because he goes on to say, he makes a difference. He uses this metaphor of theatre of Leibniz, as opposed to the machinery of Husserl, or the cumbersome machinery. And as so I think that's kind of because he talks about play, doesn't he? He talks about this kind of notion of play. And we've got things, so, and within this section, the second level, it starts to get much more kind of, well, how should we say, unpredictable things, perhaps unpredictable. This is when he brings in this notion of nomadic distribution. So that this, which you've talked about before. So it's a distribution that's not fixed in advance. It's not setting up to. It's in opposition to the notion of sedentary distribution. So the kind of the fields with all the hedges around them, whereas the nomadic distribution is completely open within the field in which it's operational, and within that there is this notion of. So he goes on. So it says the event, it behooves the event to be subdivided endlessly. This is the nomadic distribution. It can be subdivided and endlessly, also be reassembled in one and the same event. And the singular points can be distributed according to mobile and community figures, make every throw of the dice, every throw, one and the same cast, an analytical point. So this is very much that kind of feel we've looked at already, of the kind of the heterogeneous series kind of communicating and being made active through this the paradoxical element that kind of circulates within them. So yeah, that he goes, Leibniz did not attain the free character of this play. He nevertheless assembled all consequence at the level of the actualization, which preoccupies us at this point.
and then he dives in and he starts talking through some examples of this. The lines I really like is actually in the next paragraph where he starts to really explain it and say it very clearly. That now we're in this sort of secondary point, his phrasing. We are no longer faced with an individuated world constituted by means of already fixed singularities organized into convergent series, nor are we faced with determined individuals which express this world. We are now faced with the aleatory point of singular points, with the ambiguous sign of singularities, or rather with that which represents that sign, and which holds good for many of these worlds, or, in the last analysis, for all worlds, despite their divergences and the individuals which inhabit them. To skip a few sentences, all object X are persons and are defined by predicates, but these predicates are no longer the analytic predicates of individuals determined within a world which carry out the description of these individuals, which is the first layer that we've talked about, the terrain as he calls it. Now we're in the second layer. On the contrary, they are predicates which define persons synthetically and open different worlds and individualities to them as so many variables and possibilities. For Adam, to be the first man and to live in a garden. Or the Fang, to hold a secret and to be disturbed by an intruder. As far as the absolutely common object in general is concerned, with respect to which all worlds are variables, its predicates are the primary possibilities or the categories. Instead of each world being the analytic predicate of individuals described in series, it is rather the incompossible worlds, which are the synthetic predicates of persons defined in relation to disjunctive syntheses. Which
You've gone, Brooks.
did I really just talk for 20 fucking minutes? Oh my god. Oh,
You could distribution.
I cut out distribution? Really?
It's only a short break.
All right, where was distribution? Where did distribution? Where was it in the reading? Where was I?
Right before Derek intervened.
I think you cut off at the disjunctive synthesis, didn't you?
Yeah.
Well, my brain stopped working.
We left with, I hope you can hear me, I'm just online by phone, with this notion of new predicates that are synthetic in their production of subjectivities, or rather of individuals, not just predicates that are ascribed to something already existing.
I was reading, correct? Sorry, my brain.
Right.
Yeah. So the switch that's happening here, and not to dive forward directly into AO too much, but I kind of can't help it at this point. As we start talking about the experience of defining who we are, or what Brooks is, or what Jack is, or what any of us are, like the subject, ultimately comes from these aleatory points, from the nonsense of things. This idea that the things that define us actually come out of these elements that are not simply the pure description or distribution of bodies, but instead the predicates which define persons synthetically open these worlds up. The phrasing he uses, instead of each world being the analytic predicate of individuals described in the series, which is kind of that first layer, it is rather the incompossible worlds, which are the synthetic predicates of persons defined in relation to disjunctive syntheses. I think that's where I got cut off. Is that about right? I think I actually just re-explained what I was trying to say anyway. God, I can't believe. Kept going. I want to know how I got muted. That's the fun part. I'll leave it there. I'll let someone else jump in.
I think just continuing in that paragraph, So he says from this thinking, the idea of properties and classes, because this is the subject is predicates which define predicates of the person define the person synthetically. And from this, we can derive properties and classes. So he said properties and classes are grounded in the order of the person. It's because persons themselves. So again, it's this kind of difference is defining the difference between a person and not defining it implicitly. Explicitly, but implicitly there is a difference between the person and the individual. In the individual, it says this is because persons are primarily classes having one single member, and their predicates are properties having one constant. Each person is sole member of his or her class, with a class which nevertheless constituted by the world's possibilities and individuals pertain to it. So each person is just one member, but they have this capacity for endless kind of variety, shall we say, because it's synthetic. Other things can be brought into it.
Would be correct to think of this kind of development in terms of the Kantian, notion of the the analytic, a priori analytic, propositions that define the individual, and coming into the world, but not interacting with the world so much until he begins to, develop this synthetic interaction with the world. And that's when the individual, a different kind of individual, comes into being.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's bringing in, that's the main difference, that things are brought, synthetic brings things in from beyond, from outside. And here he goes on, he gives a kind of classification. So following on from this, so the entire deduction is as follows: one person's two classes, one single member, three extensive classes of variable properties. I mean, this is kind of interesting because he kind of, I don't know, because earlier on, one of the things when he talks about Stoics, he said that they, I know, actually, this might be follow on from the Stoics, because he said that they number their propositions. So 1, 2, 3, and it appears he might be doing the same here. So persons, classes, extensive classes, variable properties.
It seems like it, and he gets very, very specific with it. He says, first, beginning with singularities events, which constitute it as the two stages of passive genesis. First, the beginning of the singularities events, which constitute it, sense engenders a first field, wherein it is actualized. The Umwelt, which organizes the singularities in circles of convergence, individuals which express these worlds, states of bodies, mixtures or aggregates of these individuals, analytic predicates which describe these states. Then a second, very different field appears, built upon the first, the Welt common to several or to all worlds, the persons who define this something in common, synthetic predicates which define these persons, and the classes and properties which derive from them. Just as the first stage of the Genesis is the work of sense, the second is the work of non-sense, which is always co-present to sense. It is for this reason that the two stages and their distinction are necessarily founded. This the setup he's got here, piecing together all of it. It felt like that was a good time to mention and move on to that next paragraph there, because I really like the phrasing there.
Yeah, then he returns to these two ideas of sense, good sense, and common sense, which again, which are the opposites of the paradox.
And he also assigns good sense and common sense to each of these different fields. Like, so the first one he assigns and says, in accordance with the first, we find good sense taking shape. In accordance with the second, we find common sense taking shape. Like, they're almost generated out of these two parts of sense and nonsense, that each one of these sort of generate that, and then out of that, good sense and common sense come to be. Good sense out of the first, the layers of bodies, that sort of first part of the transcendental field, and then common sense, that which the subjects are starting to find things in common, as he puts it, something in common. Those synthetic predicates ultimately start creating common sense with it. But they're not transcendentals. He's very clear here. It feels like instead he's saying, no, they're generated, they're made as part of this overall process.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's been said here is that the so we have good sense and common sense is kind of coming out of this, perhaps. But he said the Leibniz error was to found his thinking upon the outcome. So they were his thinking they were examples of common sense and good sense. Whereas one of the basic principles of Deleuze is that the outcome can never reflect the foundation on which it's founded. I think that's one of his fundamental thoughts.
Oh, and he
That's why it
outlines
said
it super clearly. Go ahead, sorry.
I was just going to say that's why it says the sorry, I've just lost it now. He says sorry, I lost it. So I'm just looking for what I was looking for and I can't find it. Sorry. Oh, sorry, but it would be now to conceive of these produced principles if they were transcendentals. That is, it would be now to conceive in their image the sense and nonsense from which they're derived. So the outcome might have a principle of sense and common sense and good sense, but he said you shouldn't go back to its origin. Say this is the sense and nonsense are like this. That's a fundamental error, but it's one that he said that Leibniz is making.
Well, and he goes on to continue that critique by saying, ultimately Husserl is providing himself with a ready-made form of common sense and conceives of the transcendental as the person or ego, and fails to distinguish between X as the form of produced identification and quite different X. The next sentence, in truth, the person is Ulysses, no one, properly speaking, but a produced form, derived from this impersonal transcendental field. The individual is always an individual in general, born, like Eve, from Adam's side, from the singularity which extends itself over a line of ordinary points, and starts from the pre-individual transcendental field, the production of subjectivity, ultimately. And Lou is spot on. I'm just going to quote you, Lou. The Bergsonian point that the basic error of most philosophy is confusing the process with the product. Yeah, I made that joke on Twitter yesterday. It's spot on. And Schelling and a whole bunch of others, but I'll say it's Bergson, because I like Bergson more.
So the point is when Ulysses introduces himself to the Cyclops, he says he's nobody. And after he escapes from the Cyclops cave, having lost some men and so forth, he tells the Cyclops his name, and because of that, the Cyclops can call down a curse upon him and have Poseidon, who is his relative, try to destroy Ulysses.
Yeah. So I think it's useful to go through that whole section at the end. So just following on from what Kent was just saying, in truth, the person is Ulysses, no one properly speaking, but a produced form derived from this impersonal transcendental field. And the individual is always an individual in general, born like Eve from Adam's side, from a singularity, which extends to a line of ordinary points, starts from the pre-individual transcendental field. So I think he's kind of summing up. Sorry, this background. I'll just stop with some background noise.
See, it's kind of interesting that in Odysseus, he's held prisoner on this on this island by the nymph, I think Calypso, and so he escapes from that island because Athena asks Zeus to set him free, and so then Poseidon almost kills him in the journey to Scheria, and when he gets onto Scheria, he's just naked and there's nothing. He has nothing. And so he has to go through this series of recognition scenes to get back his personality as being a hero of the Trojan War and prove himself. And so, he kind of goes from this anonymous person to who he is as a person, Ulysses, through a series of recognitions. So it's interesting that Deleuze uses that here to try to distinguish the pre-personal from the personal.
And correct me if I'm wrong, Kent, because it's been a long time. When Odysseus, when he fucks up and reveals his name to the Cyclops, isn't it out of like pride or mocking and being a dick? Like there's an edge where it's not just, hey, my name's this. It's he's like laughing and mocking him, and that pride is sort of intended to be sort of part and parcel with the name suddenly being revealed, which I think also it adds a nice edge to that.
Yeah, it's a manifestation of hubris.
Thank you. That's the word.
He feels because he's escaped from the Cyclops and defeated him, he can tell him his name, but that becomes the source of all of his problems, because then Poseidon, who's the relative of Cyclops, tries to track him down and kill him.
So we are all no one, properly speaking, but we are produced, derived from this impersonal transcendental field.
One thing to keep in mind is that, when Merleau-Ponty talks about this, he relates it to reflexes. When the doctor hits your knee with a little hammer, and you have this reflexive. So everyone has that who's healthy, and so that's the kind of thing we're talking about as being anonymous and pre-personal.
Or is this a statement on common sense and good sense?
Sorry, I didn't catch that. What was the question?
Yeah, it's just we're talking about Ulysses, hubris, and pride, and so forth. Is that kind of like the trap or the mistake of common sense and good sense? That where it was susceptible to this kind of human folly?
I mean, the sentence that ends it, that's a really good insight, because Deleuze has the line here: good sense and common sense are therefore undermined by the principle of their production and are overthrown from within by paradox. So I think there's a fair answer to say yes to that. To just read the ending of this, because I really like it. In Lewis Carroll's work, Alice would be rather like the individual or the monad, which discovers sense and has already a foreboding of nonsense while climbing back up to the surface from a world into which she fell, but which is also enveloped in her and imposes on her the difficult law of mixtures. Sylvie and Bruno would be rather like vague persons who discover nonsense and its presence to sense in something common to several worlds, a world of men and a world of fairies. You know, Sylvie and Bruno, they switch back and forth pretty quickly between them. So, okay, yes, I would say for sure it feels like that as well to me. I like that.
Thank you.
Well, it's kind of interesting that common sense is considered, being able to tell what's good, what makes sense and what is nonsense. Then it seems like good sense is to go beyond that and to kind of know what the best thing to do is in that situation that you're in.
Yeah, but Deleuze associates good sense and common sense with doxa, right? The dogmatic image of thought.
I think we
Yes,
saw
he
that.
especially does.
Saw that earlier. Yeah, I think you're right about that.
And I think he even refers to him occasionally as orthodoxa, which is
I think the reason that he brings up good sense and common sense is that Aristotle talks about these things, and so it's kind of a way to put it back into the tradition and say, when I'm talking about sense, I'm talking about something that has been around for a long time.
It's again this problem of genesis he talks about, and I hope you can hear me with just my phone here. If I'm too quiet, please say it. So it's the problem of genesis he mentions already, and something that Husserl then later in his works tends to as well, because there is this problem when you have this transcendental assumption of a goodwill or of a common sense that is striving for some sort of generality or some sort of in a teleological.
Whoops, I think we lost you, Lou.
Oh,
no,
it's tried.
It'd be triad. Wrong German.
Sorry.
That you strive for something in this sense. But yeah, it's this problem of genesis, and I would say that you don't have preset forms of individuality and subjectivity. So it is something he later develops with this notion of the take, with affects and violence in his work on Francis Bacon, also in his analysis of Spinoza. So and of Leibniz, because we have this notion of the in the fold of the monad as something like a room that can only communicate through its own membrane, through its walls, so to speak. So this room can only see through its own walls or things that inscribe itself from the outside, this nonsense that is just made sensible through its own walls, and something like the affect and the process of affection becomes essential for creating even these notions of the subject. And later then the common sense is something more like the communication between these monads and constituted individuals that are built also by their surroundings, and they at the same time build their own Umwelt, their own environment through which they are able to communicate. So it's way more interesting, this reciprocal nature between something that is constituted by its surroundings, but also creating these, that is essential to understand this notion, for example, of common sense and of sense in general for Deleuze. Something that is not thought of before in this way, because it is just something that is set as transcendental, given, or as something categorical we just have to discover or to dig up in the process of our cognitive everyday happening or of perception.
So for Deleuze, both Husserl and Leibniz, were didn't go far enough, and they settled on this common sense and good sense as a kind of a way of being without going any further, right? For Leibniz, it's he assigned philosophy as the a way of creating concepts, but he also said that provided that they do not overthrow the established sentiment. So in other words, he was settled on what is common sense and good sense, just as Husserl did, right?
Yeah, I would say so.
I think what's interesting about this series is that he's producing a positive theory of how these things work, and and he's bringing together a lot of elements and synthesizing them together into this theory that he's got based on the idea of genetic phenomenology. And there's a commentator called Joe Hughes that develops this idea of genetic phenomenology in Deleuze. So there's someone who's worked out what is the connection between Deleuze and genetic phenomenology. If you're interested in looking at that.
So did we actually get through this section in like record time? And I thought this was going to be like a nightmare, awful time. This is not bad. Like I genuinely was like, cool, this is going to be awful and a train wreck.
I think your diagram really helped.
Yeah, the diagram really helped. The notes, and I posted the PDF a few times. I'll post it again a little bit later. I tend to agree with this person who took the notes that a lot of this is just about talking through the process of becoming. That's what logic of sense is about, is talking through the sort of generation of everything. And I think thinking through this first level and second level, and I know we're about to get into more as we move through, because this is the ontological genesis. And we're about to move into, I believe, the logical genesis, which is the 17th, which will be next week. And then that one is a whole other thing. So it's going to be a lot to get through, but they sort of layer on top of this. And so this ontological level of things, the generation of sense and nonsense, and how these elements basically create the individuals and then the persons. Sense being the individuals, the persons coming out of nonsense, coming out of the inability for things to be compassible, the incompossibility of things, which is a great word for this. Generating subjectivity is a really... I like this. I liked it. Thoughts, comments, please. Anyone, if you're having questions or any of this, we have a lot of time. Have some fun.
Yeah, I just want to get my head around this final paragraph. So I think what is said here So he talks at beginning, so the paragraph beginning, we cannot follow this entire deduction in detail, but he sets out the two stages of the passive genesis. So this is the kind of key thing he's searching for. The passive, this paradox, it's paradoxical, it's passive, but it's also productive. And he says that the singularity event, so the first one constitutes sense, engenders the first field of the environment, which is organized singularities in cases, circles of convergence, which express individuals express these world states, bodies, mixture of these, and these individuals' analytic predicates describe these states. Now, I was trying. This has the appearance of being good sense. I was trying to get my head around this relation between this and good sense and common sense. This structure, this first level of the has this appearance of organizing things in a sedentary fashion, which is the characteristic of good sense. Then the second is built on the first, the world. So that's the Umwelt, the organized environment. The environment is organized, it seems, in this first stage of the passive genesis. In the second stage, which is built on the first, the world is common to several or to all worlds. The person is defined as something in common. So this is where the common sense is appearing. Synthetic predicates which define these persons and the classes and properties. So they have this notion of common sense, which has this thing of bringing things together. And what he's saying fundamentally is that Leibniz and Husserl as well, they see both these outcomes as evidence that they are examples of good sense and common sense. But as Deleuze says, they're actually coming out of nonsense and sense. He says good, and on towards the end of this paragraph, and that good sense and common sense are undermined by the principles of their production and are overthrown from within by paradox. So this is a point I think that he's saying that Leibniz and Husserl missed. They look at the outcome, but they don't see the principle the thing on which they take the outcome as the principle, whereas the principle is sense and nonsense which produce them in the first place.
Yeah, and this goes back to, I think, what Triad and Lou were saying earlier, that it's almost the same critique. I mean, it's one Deleuze has with a lot. It's not just Deleuze, but the Bergson notion of the problem with philosophy in general is you mistake the product for the process. Yes, no, we have commodities, but who cares about how they get produced is kind of the Marxist way of looking at society. Deleuze would say the same thing of the unconscious or sense or any of them, and it's about talking through good and common sense are products. They're things. They're not a process. So what makes these things? What makes these elements? And that's, I think, the big point here is that sense and nonsense produce good and common sense. They're not copies of it. That is our sort of mistake, the subject out the other side that is created by this as well, that may identify a little too closely perhaps with good and common sense. But ultimately, good and common sense themselves are undermined by paradox that exists within them, which we went through a lot, actually, in, I think, 4 different series. But yeah, that's I think, the major point here. Again, to just go back to it, it's these are just elements. Let's talk about what makes them, and then find that base layer. And to Deleuze, it's that base layer is the monad, the singularities, the elements themselves. The maybe partial objects, he might say, in a later life.
Yeah, also these are not reducible to concepts or to significations, I would say, because with these we have some sort of productive tension within these paradoxes. So they are not reducible to just mere logical or conceptual forms like and that's something. I don't know if we already talked about it, but is this term of the passive genesis maybe a smug nudge in direction to Husserl, that he takes his passive syntheses and tries to historicize and processualize them in some sort of sense.
I don't know if it's I mean, it might be. Deleuze always does that by writing with a wry smile, mocking people with very simple sentences that you kind of can't tell. But I don't know if that's the case here. I think it's more in line with his writings on Kant and his background in Kant, that he's talking through kind of, when he says passive genesis, it's to him, it means creation that is sort of on its own, that isn't acted upon and doesn't really act on anything, that it is a generative process in and of itself. That's the passive syntheses, as he discussed earlier in this, and also in a few of the other books he did at this time, like DNR, which is basically about the passive syntheses and difference in repetition, obviously. It feels more like it's that. That makes sense? No?
Oh yeah, definitely, it helps. Thanks.
It's just a guess, because I mean, the answer is we don't fucking have a clue. But it feels more, and he and Guattari go on the passive syntheses of the unconscious, like the syntheses of the unconscious are, like, the first one is essentially a semi-passive, the reaching for connection, whatever it is. Like, there's some play with this kind of consistently throughout a lot of his writing ongoing. I'm not saying that they're passive syntheses, I'm saying the terms used is pretty consistent, especially at this point. So our persons are constituted through the mixture of bodies and events that make us literally the thing that's individuated, and at some point the weird shit and nonsense gets produced, and that's when we get to go, oh, I exist, excellent, here we go. And the me gets to look at things and be a subject.
I think it's also interesting how he brings divergence into the mix, that it's not the nonsense is, I mean, part of that is that there's divergence rather than convergence. The convergence produces the person, but there's this mixed into it is also divergence.
So the divergence, to me, was a callback to when we were talking about the problematic and also aleatory points. That the way that singularities sort of happen and play is they evoke problems. They evoke these things that are places or zones of indetermination. And just to read from these notes, and the event to be indefinitely subdivided, and which distributes the singular points, one and multiple. Incompossible worlds have something objectively in common with representing the ambiguous sign of the genetic element, in which many worlds appear as solutions to one problem. The incompossible worlds become variants of the same story, and that's when he starts going into Borges, which, if you haven't, we have a lovely recording somewhere in our history where Jack and everyone we went through Borges. Garden of Forking Paths, which is the reference here with Fang and all of that. Wonderful book. But kind of the idea, as I read it, is that singularities at their base level are just the mixtures. As they start coming together, that second layer, the nonsense that gets produced from those incompatibilities, allow and how to add to this. They are the paradoxical elements that are between things that are divergent series that don't necessarily go together, that aren't perfectly in line, that don't allow for signification in the same way as straight sense making, I guess, would do it, where yes, boom, 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 things go right in line, and it's always that. The divergence, where the signification diverges between two series, that aleatory point that sort of is the nonsense that comes from such a thing. This is where the subject is able to be born, because it leaves room for that, I don't know how to put it, some special something, maybe is the phrase I would say, that element that allows the subject to emerge and believe it exists, to have that room inside of all of this, that divergence. I think I used the phrase, the zipper of meaning between 2 points that sort of sews them together. That's how I took this, Kent. Sorry, I didn't mean to go off on a tangent, but that's how I sort of take it, that we're talking about kind of these generative elements. And on the one side, you have sense, nonsense in the way that singularities work, that element between them, that space that is created, where there is no, that where it's just pure nonsense, mostly of the surface, is where the subject's able to be made. And it's really interesting.
Yeah, I think it's kind of interesting that chaos is kind of a balance between divergence and convergence, because you have the basin of attraction, but as the chaotic system, say logistic equation, circulates, it's creating new information all the time, because it takes a different path each time.
I am Triad. I am getting pangs of Cora here. Yes, like it feels like there's a space between things. Yeah, a little bit. But no, Kent, I think I'm completely with you. The idea of sort of this constant weaving of sense and nonsense, and the back and forth, and the generative properties of that as it moves. The something that is X common to all worlds, that commonality that produces ultimately common sense, sort of as a byproduct of it, or as that second level, is fascinating, because ultimately it's saying that common sense comes out of nonsense. That in order to piece together these diverging series, the necessity is for us to find the commonalities, and therefore the things that are common to all worlds we sort of place and assign, and we find the thread that we're able to sew all of it together. But these are just the commonalities, and as such, that's the common sense. That's the way that works. It's a really interesting way to sort of, I don't know, rotate the view of things.
Yeah, this metaphor is pretty helpful, and I guess this with the thread and weaving and stuff like that, because it's implying that there is not this way of common sense or the goodwill outside of us, but it is something that is produced constantly and all the time, like information that is created through chaos or through noise by assigning to it some form of order, some redundancy, and
You cut out.
Under some system or structure. So I guess there are some interesting analogies here.
Yeah, it seems to be saying that we organize the world according to good sense and common sense. They're the two, and well, it's what he calls doxa. They're both examples of doxa, but they're always undercut by the paradox, a thing which opposes doxa.
Well, and the person, the me, the subject, is generated alongside common sense. Like the phrasing and the way that they talk about it here, it's not that there's like, a dozen layers that make common sense and then something else and then something else and then ego. It's these elements, the beginning elements that make common sense and good sense, are the thing that make person and ego. And those things get married. So I get to be Brooks dealing with common sense in this space. But the elements that created me to do that are actually the ones that also generate the common sense and my understanding of the sort of law of averages of how things are supposed to be or how things are, as sort of sense sort of plays through me. I really like it. Any more thoughts? Any questions, comments, anything else?
Yeah. As Lou already mentioned, these Bergson vibes, these Schelling vibes, also Nietzsche, because it is almost this image of a continuous, or better, an eternal production of new forms. They are then get destroyed again in the doxa when they become too rigid, too static. And I'm reminded by Schelling, for example, when one looks at his late philosophy, because he does a similar thing, because he's very much criticizing this notion of systematic transcendental philosophy in idealism, especially the philosophy of identity that Fichte is building with the I equals I, who tries to build every aspect of theoretical and practical philosophy on the I, that the I is just a self-reflexive thing that is looking at itself, and by that we can derive everything. But this is just talking about these forms of doxa, or the ur-doxa, so to speak, of thinking as something that's just happening and looking in a negative way to specific distinctions, in this sense differences, and by that also to identities. And that's something Schelling wants to break up in his late philosophy. I guess it's the same for Deleuze here, because for him then this reflection is something that is not reflecting on the I itself, but to something outside of it, to this alterity that is not reducible to some concept, that is constantly not a result of something in thinking, but this underlying productive movement that is bringing forth every new way of thinking and thinking in general. And that's why there's always this tendency or need to think about something, and not only about thinking and concepts in general. And that's something that is then affecting the subject-object relationship as well, because we then don't tend to think of these transcendental apperception or a singular point that is just creating everything outside of it, but is taking the whole process to at least some level as its object. So we have this thinking about what could be laying outside of thinking, and what could not only be reduced to it and its motion. So it's not like in Hegel, that the absolute there is a holistic result of this logical or conceptual process, but for Schelling it is rather the process of production itself that is the absolute of the producing in a verbal form, and that is not holistic in this way, and always confronted with new ways of revelation, and how things reveal and create them, not only themselves but are created by other forces outside of it, in this constant tension, and not an inner logic that is just reproducing itself.
So for Deleuze, there's no enduring subject, is there? Just because it's just something that is a part of common sense. That's a very temporary and in a constant flow of change. So
Yeah.
there's right.
As as far as I understand it, the subject for Deleuze is just merely an effect on the surface of these productive tensions.
Yes. All right. Any last questions? Anyone? We'll hang for a
Yeah, I
second.
wonder what he means by the something equals X. That's an object. So an object is the object. Does that reflect back on a subject, or so if there's no subject, is there? Does it have to be? There has to be an object.
I think this comes from Kant in Critique of Pure Reason. I think he uses this kind of variable terminology for the noumena.
Okay.
In series 15, Deleuze, it's 105 of my version, uses it very cleanly. The double series of the condition, that is, of the empirical consciousness and its objects, must therefore be founded on an originary instance which retains the pure form of objectivity, object equals X, and the pure form of consciousness, which constitutes the former on the basis of the latter. And that's him not directly saying that he believes this, but this is him utilizing that as a beginning critique of Kant, actually. Because he then goes on to say this requirement does not seem that legitimate. But it's very much a reference to sort of Kant. And I want to say Sartre, he's commenting there, I think, on Sartre's critique of Kant as well. But don't quote me on that. In fact, I'm just going to delete that from the recording. No one knows I said that. But I think that's right. So it's a play with the idea of objectivity, where the object equals X. This idea of empirical reality being this thing that is very clearly, flatly there, where object equals X is a thing is a thing. And he goes on to then say that in this series, the universal ego is precisely the person corresponding to something equals X common to all worlds, just as the other egos are the persons corresponding to a particular thing equals X common to several worlds. It's continuing to use that sort of setup. All objects equal X are persons and are defined by predicates, but these predicates are no longer analytical predicates of individuals determined within a world, which carry out a description of these individuals. So it's utilizing in a critique.
Right. Okay, thank you.
I think the idea is it could be any object.
Yeah, I think it's trying to play with the idea of what things are, I guess. The common sense or good sense notion of what things are, or what they're based in, or what their predicates are, especially persons, which is what he's aiming directly for here. But it's for sure, it's a critique in that direction.
I think the kind of key point here is that he's building nonsense in and bringing the distinction between sense and nonsense to the fore, because usually nonsense is just ignored. But there's this kind of dialectical tension between sense and nonsense, and he wants to make that an intrinsic part of the model that he's building here.
Well, the idea of pure consciousness is something is without the is free of the common sense and good sense, and it's a kind of consciousness without a subjectivity.
Another thing is that we should kind of mention is that, Plato comes up with the divided line where half of it's ratio and the other half's doxa. So he's talking about the doxa part with his good sense and common sense. And then the lowest rung, the kind of lowest limit of the divided line is metis, which is trickery. And so that's when you start getting into paradox.
So pure consciousness would be below the divided line then. Huh?
Say it again.
Pure consciousness would be able to perceive object, x equals object x would be below the divided line of Plato.
Well, that's a good point. I guess I never thought about that. Yeah, I don't know where pure consciousness is in relationship to the divided line. It might be outside of the divided line.
Right. So for Deleuze, that he's talking about, the kind of sense that includes nonsense, right? And paradox.
Yeah, I think that this is the kind of great thing about this book is that it brings our attention to nonsense and the role that it plays, kind of like virtual particles, where the sense of the nonsense is like created and destroyed, and everything that we're usually talking about is the conserved particles, right? And so, but below that's these virtual particles of sense and nonsense being created and destroyed all the time, and no one talks about that usually. Yeah, like when we write a book, we do our best to get rid of all the nonsense.
So I'm not sure that I can completely discuss the question of pure consciousness in the terms that you've just laid out. But I thought of it because it's an interesting perspective to think it in relation to Bergson. And for Bergson, consciousness is something being conscious is just a difference in degree or is a kind of being. It's a mode of being. He says something like the difference between being and being perceived is a difference in degree. And he later adapts this notion of a mode of being, consciousness as a mode of being, that he basically says that there are two scales in which everything has to exist. And the one is being causally determined, and the other is being consciously given. And then basically everything exists in a balance of these two scales. Every mode of being is basically a mix of a certain degree of being causally determined and a certain degree of being conscious. And with yeah, sorry, I'm not sure where I'm going there, but yeah, okay. So the point there is that consciousness as a distinct thing from things, like consciousness of things being something different than things, vanishes there, which is something that I find is also present in Deleuze, right?
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. So in Husserl, consciousness is kind of defined in terms of intentionality. And so there has to be an object for every kind of act of consciousness. But he doesn't deal with like awareness. And so it's only later that Gurevich comes along and adds in gestalts and adds in the margins of consciousness and starts talking about awareness, which is kind of non-intentional consciousness. And I think even in genetic phenomenology, he still thinks that there's intentionality is the basis of everything. And of course, like Deleuze, he's trying to avoid phenomenology, so he doesn't kind of like talk about this very much.
All right. Any last questions? Because I know we've got a bunch of people in here who haven't had a chance to talk. Any questions, comments, anything you have that you want us to dive into? Questions, stuff to add? Feel free. Now would be the time. I'm getting close to shutting it down.
So I guess that was all perfectly clear.
It seems like we did a very good job explaining. I don't if we haven't, feel free to let us know. Feels like we did an okay job. I came away with a better understanding for sure of this series. And it'll help a lot, I know, as we go into the next. Yeah, I think thank all of you for joining. I'm going to go ahead and close it out now as we finish out static ontological genesis. Thank all of you for coming. We will be here again next week, same time, same channel, going over the static logical genesis as we move beyond just this sort of ontological level of things. It's going to be, it'll be a ride too. But thank all of you for very much joining with us, and